Greetings to all the learners of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Open University. Today, as a part of your program, that is MBA First Year Sem 1 course on managerial communication, we shall be dwelling on Unit 1, which is to do with communication, meaning and process, and Lesson 2, where we talk about your communication networks and types. So, let us see how people are actually communicating, whether the communication is direct, where one person is communicating with the other person, or through what lines does the communication flow, especially in an organization. Now, in an informal setup, if you see our daily communications which happen either with our family or with friends and all, it is free flow. But when you talk about communication inside a business, that particular communication is not always free flow. So, therefore, there is a network or there is a type through which the communication happens. So, communication network basically is how information flows within the organization. See, usually in organization, information does not flow free. There is some kind of a system which is being followed for the flow of information. Communication networks are actually regular patterns of communication which can be there between one person to another, or relationships through which information flow. So, how that particular flow of information is managed, regulated and structured is what basically is communication network. So, we are talking about how information is flowing in the company, because information in a formal setup is not free flow. Say for example, if a lower level employee in a company wants to talk to the director of the company, then he cannot directly go and speak as you speak in a house to your mother or to your spouse. But in a formal setup, you have hierarchical positions, and when a lower level employee has to communicate, he has to pass through all those hierarchical levels as such. So, there is a flow of communication which happens. Same way, when the board of directors, for example, want to communicate something to all the employees of the company, then there can be a flow of communication through managers, through deputy managers, assistant managers, and that's how the employees will come to know. So, that pattern or a physical network or a flow which happens inside a system is what is your communication network, because in formal setup, communication is not free flowing. There is a network or there is a system which is being followed for flow of communication. So, communication network can also be understood as the hardware and the software which is facilitating communication. Like it can be in the form of text, it can be in the form of voice messages, data, files, videos which are being sent. In companies, what happens, most of the communication is also happening by using computer systems, intranet. So, you either have a LAN or a WAN, internet, intranet or extranet, through which that hardware component which can be there. Similarly, depending on the nature of the company, the kind of processes which are there, how is the office or the factory building planned, that is the layout, depending on that also communications can be, the task of communicating can become very simple or it can be complex. You can have companies which are into proper manufacturing, for example, then their flow of communication will be different. If the company is into a service industry, for example a call center or a bank, then the flow of information will happen in a different manner. So, depending on application or the nature of business also, the flow of communication can be different inside an organization. Now, when we say communication network, we also in technical words talk about the type of network which is called as topology. So, we say network topology, which basically talks about the pattern or the flow of communication inside a company. So, physical arrangement of participants, how are the people physically arranged in relation to one another when you are communicating, that is what is topology. So, network topology is describing physical arrangement of participants. For example, employees A, B, C, D, E are there. So, who is communicating with whom and how is A placed in relation to B, C, D and E? That is nothing but the physical arrangement of the participation in relation to each other within a network. So, if the network is related to these 5 employees, A to E, how are all these employees physically arranged is what is your communication network or network topology. So it will describe logical arrangement of participation in relation to each other. So when communication is happening, how are the participants logically arranged in relation to one another. Say the president of a company wants to communicate something to the supervisor of production, for instance. Then how is the arrangement actually happening? So the president of a company would actually call the president of production operation, so or the team leader of production, and then try to communicate with the floor worker or the production supervisor who is there. So that is the logical arrangement of participation in relation to one another. All those participants who are there in the entire communication network, how are they physically and logically placed in relation to one another is called as your network topology in terms of your communication. Now in companies, if you actually happen to see the hardware part of it, the network topology, you talk about different types of topologies which are there. One is called as mesh topology. Mesh topology basically talks about all the participants who are connected to one another through separate communication line. For example, supervisor A is wanting to communicate with worker B, C, D, E. Now A can communicate directly through a separate communication line with B, separate communication line with C, a separate communication line with D or with E. This kind of an arrangement, if it is there, where each participant can connect with the other participant through a separate communication line, then it is called as your mesh topology of communication. Mesh topology, the flexibility will be very low in this type of a topology, and in companies this type of a network is hardly used because you cannot have so many separate dedicated lines of communication which can be established. So mesh topology is hardly used in the organizations. Second type of topology or the network system that you would have is called as bus topology, which is also called as line topology, where all the participants are trying to communicate over the same line, and they can be connected to one another through small sublines also which can be there. Since the transmitted message can be seen by all the participants, then easily same message can be conveyed to all at once because there is a common line of communication which is there, which is called as a bus topology. Then you can also have a topology system which is similar to bus, which is called as a tree topology, except that you can have different branches of communication. For example, people within the production department, they communicate with one another through common lines. So within production department there is bus topology, but outside production department, if their communication is with production and marketing, they can follow something called as a tree topology which can be there. The network can be different there. Sometimes they also communicate through something called as ring topology, where you talk about creation of a physical ring or a kind of a structure where a transmitted message is forwarded from one participant to another participant. So A is communicating something to B and B forwards the message to C, C does it to D, D will convey the message to E and E will forward the message to F. So that way what happens is there is one sender, and that particular sender's message is being sent by all the receivers who are present in the entire network which is there. The problem with this kind of a network is a failure of one participant can lead to the failure of entire message which is there. That is a problem with the ring topology. Then one popularly used topology is called as star topology, where all participants are connected through a center station via 2 or 3 communication lines which can be there, where the center station can be active or a master center point for all the networks which can happen. All these topologies where we discuss, that is mesh or bus or tree, ring topology, or you talk about the topology which is related to star, all of these are all the technical part of it to understand how people are physically placed or what kind of a logical arrangement actually happens. Now in an organization, when you are choosing how to communicate, you can make a choice of the communication network depending upon how fast you want to communicate, what is the speed of the message. So the physical property of the message in terms of how quickly do you want the message to go. If your message has to go through so many people, then speed will not be there. So in that particular situation, you have to be very careful with what type of a network topology are you using. Similarly, what kind of a noise is involved in the entire place, what kind of equipments or environment is present around, how expensive is it for the company to establish that structure in the organization, that also plays a very important role. So these are one way of understanding the various topologies which are there. But actually, to understand a communication network, which is nothing but methods which are employed by people to pass on the information in a company, we are basically talking about one method or all the methods which can be used by an employer or by people in an organization. Usually people in company, how do they communicate is, there is something called as a vertical network. In vertical network, what happens is that you would have a superior who is communicating to a subordinate, which we call as top down approach. So from top, message comes downwards. So superior communicating to the subordinate. Or you can have subordinate who is communicating with the superior. So you call it as bottom up approach. So in a vertical network, either the superior communicates with the subordinate, which is top down, or the subordinate communicates with the supervisor, which is called as bottom up approach. This is the vertical network which can be there, which can be followed while you are trying to communicate. Or the network can be circuit network. Circuit network is one where you talk about, for example, there are two people, A and B. A is sending message to B and B sends feedback back to the sender. So A communicates to B, and if B has received the information, understood and interpreted the communicated message properly, B will send feedback to A. So A will now know that B has understood or not understood, interpreted in the same way or not interpreted. So what happens there? You would have the sender sending the message, receiver receiving the message and then sending feedback to the sender of the original message which was there. This kind of a network, if it is followed, it is called as a circuit network which can be there. For example, in a classroom you talk about, a teacher who is actually announcing internal tests or assessments to the students. So communication happens there and the students confirm the date and the time where they give feedback that they are ready for the internal test to be taken. So what happens there? Sender is sending the message, receiver receiving it, understanding it and giving feedback about that particular message. If this kind of a network is followed, it is called as a circuit network which can be there. Or the companies also follow something called as a chain network, where if the original sender of the message is A, he will pass on the message to B. B will transfer the message to C, the message goes from C to D, and then from D to anybody else who may be there in the entire chain of communication which will be there in a company. So that way, when the message is flowing by following a system of relationship between employees in the company in the form of a chain, then it is called as a chain network, where from one person to another the message keeps flowing and the scope of feedback is very limited in this kind of a chain network which can be there. Also, the problem is with distortion. Whatever probably might have been sent by A, same may not have been communicated by B to C, C to D. By the time whoever is the person who actually has to be influenced by the message can be completely distorted by the time the end receiver is receiving that particular message in the chain network which can be there. Sometimes the companies also follow a network which is called as a wheel network, where the network looks like a wheel, as you can see, where you talk about a person A who is there in the center and trying to communicate with all the people who are around him. For example, you talk about the general manager of a company who might be communicating with functional managers. So you would have a production manager, HR manager, marketing manager. With all these managers, general manager is communicating that they all have to work towards increasing sales revenue by 10% in this year. So that message is actually flown to all the managers from the center point, which is general manager. If this kind of a network system is followed in the pattern of communication, it is called as a wheel network, where you will have somebody in the center who is passing on the message to multiple people who may be there around that central person who is there in the company. Or you can also follow a network system where you call as a star network. The network looks like a star, that's how the name star network comes there, where A is connected to more than one person, and A may be communicating to B and E at the same time. E may be communicating back to A and also communicating to somebody D. Similarly, B may be communicating with C and then communicating back with A. So that way, as you can see on the screen also, you would have the star network which can be there, where the network is like a star, where you would have people, A is the center point, communicates with B and E, B communicates with C and D, and then back the communication flows. So that way you can have a star network. Vertical is first one, where you say superior to subordinate, top down, or subordinate to superior, bottom up. Or you would say network which is circuit, A sending message to B, B giving feedback to A, circuit network. Or chain, where you will have A sending to B, B sends to C, C sends to D. So that way chain is followed. Or you can have a wheel network, where one person is in the center and sends the message to all people around him. Or network can be in the form of a star, where one person is connected to two people who may be connected back to another two, and that way a star formation of a physical arrangement of people happen. These are all the types of logical arrangement where you are expressing relationship between people who are trying to communicate in a formal setup. In an informal setup, it is free flow, so you don't have to worry about information how it is passing. But in a formal setup of organizations, there is some kind of a network which has to be basically followed, which is nothing but your communication network or topology, where it is a physical or a logical arrangement of people who are placed in the chain of communication in an organization. This is one type, that is called as communication network. Then you have various types of communication. In this network, how do people communicate? So communication can be upward, where information is exchanged up in the organizational hierarchy. For example, you talk about an organization where you would have the owner, that's the CEO of the company, and then you would have the board of directors below them. Below him you would have a general manager, assistant managers, departmental heads and employees. Now if an employee wants to communicate with a general manager, then he has to go up in the hierarchy, first to communicate with the departmental manager, who will communicate with the assistant managers, who will communicate back to the general manager. So how is the communication flowing? It is going upward from the lower level employee to the people who are there in the top in the hierarchy position. This is called as upward communication. People who are placed in the lower levels in the organization, they are trying to communicate with people who are placed in the higher authorities in the organizational hierarchy. Then communication is downward, where you talk about information exchange from the top of the organizational hierarchy to people placed down in the organizational hierarchy. So when I am saying that a general manager is trying to tell to the employees that production has to increase in this month by 10,000 units. So he is communicating downwards, where you say downward communication which will happen there. Then communication can also be lateral, where you say information is exchanged across teams, across people who can be working at the same level. So you can have a functional manager of one function like marketing, who is communicating with the production manager, which is another function, communicating with the finance manager, which is one more function. So like that, when communication is happening between various teams and various functions, we call it as lateral communication. Then this is all communication inside a company. Companies also communicate with outside world. So you talk about external communication. When communication or information is exchanged with anybody who is outside the company, that is called as your external communication which will happen. This is one way of understanding various types of communication. Another way of understanding various types of communication is on the basis of what is the method which is being used, where whether you are communicating through words spoken, words written, or whether you are communicating through non-verbal communication. So we say verbal and non-verbal, either through actions, gestures, expressions, or whether are you speaking through words written or words spoken. So verbal and non-verbal, wherein in detail we would discuss about the various types which are involved inside verbal and non-verbal. That is one, that is method or the media which we are using in order to express our communication. And you would have also based upon flow. How is the communication flowing inside a company? Whether it is flowing horizontal, where we say when communication is happening between people who are in the same level in the company, you call it as horizontal communication. All employees, for example, peers, for example, or you talk about all managers who are at the same position, they are all communicating with one another, you call it as horizontal communication. Vertical, where we say either top bosses are communicating with lower level employees, or lower level employees are communicating with top management. You talk about vertical communication. Then cross wire, where you say communication which happens free flow in an organization, cross wire communication can also be there. In companies, communication can also be based upon organizational relationship, whether there is a formal relationship in the company or whether the relationship is informal. Based on that also communication happens, which can be formal communication or informal communication. So first what we basically discussed was networks, where we said logical arrangement of people or physical arrangement of people in the entire chain of communication, where we talked about all networks, that is vertical network, circuit network, chain network, free flow, that is wheel network, or star topology. These are all types of or the networks which are there through which we communicate, that is logical arrangement of people. That is one part, that is communication network. Second part is types of communication, where we say whether communication is flowing upward, downward, lateral or outside, or whether communication is verbal, non-verbal, formal, informal, horizontal, vertical. These are all network types and communication types. But for any communication to happen, there is a lot of literature which is written upon how actually communication flows in the company, where you talk about the models of communication, where you would describe how the communication actually is happening in the company, under which various authors in the literature has given various models which are there. One first model which is given on communication was given by Aristotle, which is called as your linear model of communication, where he speaks about 5 elements in any process of communication to be present: speaker, speech, occasion, audience, effect. Who is the speaker? What is the speaker speaking? On what occasion is the speaker speaking? When, that is when is the speaker speaking, or what is the occasion? Who are the people who are listening, that is a target audience, and what effect is that speech going to have on the audience, that is the effect. That is the Aristotle's model of communication, which he speaks largely about these 5 elements to be present, where we call it as a linear model of communication, which should be there in an organization also. Who is speaking, what is being spoken, or the content. Say for example, manager has to communicate about to the employees, giving a good news that their pay package is going to increase by 1% or raise in the salaries by 10%. Now that is the speaker, is the company's owner, who is actually talking about increase in the pay, which on the occasion of some festival or annual increase it can be there, and the target audience are all employees in the company, and the impact is that employees can be happy, can show more productivity in the company, can have more sense of belongingness towards the organization, show better performances in the company. So that way you would have a linear model of communication in a formal setup as given by Aristotle. One more model which was given in the communication network is called Lasswell's model, where he tries to understand basically one-way communication. Mostly what happens in a formal setup is most of the communication is one-way. Only few organizations encourage two-way communication in company, where a subordinate can actually freely approach a superior. But most of the companies still have a very rigid communication form where it only flows downwards, which is called one-way communication. There Lasswell talks about asking 5 questions for communication. He says, who said, that is who is communicating, what is being said, through which channel, how is the person trying to communicate, what is the media or the channel used, to whom and then with what effect. So one element that he added here is channel, which was not there in the earlier Aristotle's model, which is being said. So Lasswell's model is there. Very popular model which most of us use in most managerial communication is called as Barlow's model, where you speak about SMCR, that is sender, message, channel, receiver. That sender means source. What is the source of the message? So who is the sender? From where is the message coming? Then what is the actual message? That is the content. And then channel, through which channel is the message flowing, and whoever is the receiver of that particular message. So this is Barlow's model, which is called SMCR model, where you talk about 4 components: source, message, channel and receiver. Then you also have in the literature one more model which was given by Osgood and Schramm, where they talk about reciprocal communication. How do you interpret, and then in real time, when the conversation is actually happening in the real time. We are not talking about somebody giving the message and somebody receiving at some other time. Say a circular, for example. Top boss may send a circular which may be received by an employee on some other day or some other time. But that is about, the previous model, Aristotle, Lasswell and all. But Osgood and Schramm speaks about a model where they talk about communication happening in the real time, conversation happening in the real time, and there is reciprocation which is happening from the side of the receiver. Receiver is actually understanding, interpreting, and then telling the sender what he has interpreted as well. So that way you would happen, encoding, decoding, interpretation, all that happening in the real time, which Osgood and Schramm has spoken about. Then one more model in the literature is also being told by Westley and MacLean, where they speak about communication being influenced by lot of factors like environmental, cultural and personal factors which can be there. All this we would discuss in detail when we come to the lesson on what all are the factors influencing communication. To understand here about the model, you talk about, the various factors. It can be there in the environment around the person, the physical environment in which the person is speaking, the cultural background to which the person belongs, value systems, beliefs, cultural setup in which the person is there, and also personal factors, what kind of attitude, prejudices, stereotyping a person may be having, all that has an impact on how things get communicated. So what Westley and MacLean had done is they have added few factors to the existing model of sender, receiver, message. They said that all this communication get impacted by other factors, environmental, cultural, personal factors which can be there. Then you also have a model of communication which is called transactional model, where we talk about, what kind of public and private hints or clues are given in the communication which actually impact the entire message. So when actually the sender is sending message, there can be some kind of inherent signals which can be given in the message itself. It can be in the form of non-verbal, emotional gestures which can be made, whereby apart from words spoken, I want a deeper sense of understanding beyond, literal message to be understood by the person. So that way, that is called as transactional model, where I am trying to co-create the meaning. So how is the person trying to understand other person's mind, or we basically say, are you able to read my mind? So when I am trying to tell something, whether I am encoding and decoding in the same way, the way the sender wants me to do that. So that is called co-creation of the message. Am I able to understand the message in the same mental or setup as the sender actually wants me to understand? That is also one way of putting it across, which is called as co-creation of the message which is there. Then you have one more model which is given by Frank Dance, where he speaks about, communication happening in a spiral form, cone, where, one person communicates and that communication goes to the whole world. So it's in the form of a spiral. So more in detail about, these models of communication, you would have one more session which could be there. But as of now, in this particular session, the basic understanding was related to networks and types, where we spoke about the various networks of communication, a logical flow of information in the company, where the network can be either one way like mesh network, bus topology, tree topology, line, ring, or you can have networks which can be in the form of vertical, circuit, chain network, star network, wheel network, and then various types of communication which can be upward, downward, lateral, external. Similarly, you can have types depending on whether you're communicating verbally or non-verbally, whether the communication is happening in a formal setup or informal setup, whether the communication is happening downward or upward, vertical, horizontal or cross wire. All these can be different types of communication, and for all the communication bases in the literature of managerial communication and management processes, you would have various models which are being given, right, starting from the linear model of Aristotle to latest being the Frank Dance's model of spiral communication. Several models which are there which explain how communication actually happens in the organization. So, today's lesson we dealt with these two things, that is communication network, which is vertical, which can be circuit, which can be chain, wheel or star, and then types of communication, upward, downward, lateral, cross wire, or it can be verbal, non-verbal, formal, informal. Those types and networks of communication was the main content of today's lesson. Thank you so much.